The courthouse was alive with a kind of tension that only exists when futures hang in the balance. The marble floors, polished to a sheen, reflected the heavy shuffle of shoes as people filed into the chamber. The sound of hushed voices mingled with the squeak of chairs sliding against the floor, creating a low hum beneath the more official noises of clerks sorting documents and bailiffs, barking reminders about silence and decorum. It was supposed to be a day like any other in a courtroom. Evidence presented, arguments exchanged, and testimony weighed with solemn seriousness. The trial itself had captured the public's attention for weeks, though not to the degree of sensational headlines. It was still one of those cases that seemed to carry the weight of a larger story. The defendant, a man in his mid-30s, stood accused of possession and distribution of narcotics. The prosecution leaned heavily on the testimony of a police dog, a German shepherd trained to detect illegal substances. The defense claimed the search had been unlawful, raising questions about procedure and civil rights. But on this particular day, no one expected the case itself to be overshadowed by something entirely unrelated to the law. At the back of the courtroom, a woman sat nervously in the public seating section. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, dressed in modest clothes that spoke more of necessity than of choice. Her dark hair was tied back in a quick ponytail, and she clutched a small handbag tightly in her lap. Beside her squirmed a toddler, her son, no more than 3 years old. His cheeks were round and rosy, his hair a soft tangle, and his eyes darted about with uncontainable curiosity. The woman had not intended to bring him to court. A last-minute cancellation by her sitter left her with no choice, and she had reluctantly carried the boy with her, praying that he would stay quiet enough to avoid drawing attention. She knew courtrooms were not places for children. They were for order, rules, and seriousness, 3 qualities that children rarely embodied. Still, she hoped her son's natural shyness around strangers would keep him subdued. At first, it seemed as if her prayer might be answered. The toddler sat on her lap, leaning against her chest, clutching a soft toy car he had refused to let go of that morning. She bounced her knee gently, soothing him with whispers, while trying to follow the rhythm of the trial. Lawyers spoke in precise, deliberate tones, and the judge listened intently, hands folded before him on the bench. The court reporter's keystrokes provided a steady clicking backdrop, documenting every word. The child, though, was restless in a way that only toddlers can be. His gaze flitted across the room, taking in the flags behind the judge, the stir, faces of the jury, and the defendant's anxious posture. None of this made sense to him, nor did it matter. His attention was not caught by the weight of justice, but by the bright brass buttons on a bailiff's uniform, by the way light filtered through the tall windows, and eventually most of all by the animal lying near the front. The police dog was stretched out beside his handler, a uniformed officer who sat upright, posture rigid. The dog's ears twitched occasionally, but for the most part, it seemed perfectly at ease, breathing slow and steady, its gaze shifting only when the door creaked or someone coughed. To the adults in the room, the dog was just another part of the machinery of the trial: evidence, testimony, procedure. To the child, however, the animal was magic. He leaned forward suddenly, his toy car nearly tumbling from his hand. His mother shushed him quickly, thinking he was simply squirming again. But the boy wasn't restless anymore. He was captivated. His small hand lifted and dropped toward the dog, as if resisting the urge to point. His lips parted, and he let out a soft gasp that went unnoticed by everyone except his mother, who gave him a warning look. The trial pressed on. The prosecutor was cross-examining a witness, and the exchange was growing tense. The words meant little to the child, who was fixated on the German shepherd's steady breathing and shiny coat. He watched intently, eyes wide, like he'd found a secret no one else could see. His mother stroked his hair absently, trying to divide her attention between her child and the proceedings. She knew every creak of the benches was magnified in this room, and she feared the disapproving stares of strangers. She whispered into his ear, "Baby. Just stay quiet for a little while longer." But toddlers have a strange sense of timing. They are silent when no one minds and noisy when silence is most fragile. The boy's fascination grew into a restless energy, the kind that built up until it needed release. He wriggled again, and this time his mother gave him a stern look, mouthing a warning. For a moment, he calmed. He fiddled with his toy car, rolling it between his small palms. But his gaze snapped back to the dog again and again, as if the animal held some silent truth that demanded to be acknowledged. Around them, the tension of the trial thickened. The defense attorney rose to make an objection, his voice sharp. The judge leaned back, eyebrows arched, considering the point. Jurors shifted, some frowning, some nodding faintly. For all the adults present, the drama was in the words exchanged and the rules being tested. For the boy, none of it mattered. The dog mattered. The child's mother could feel him shifting on her lap again, his little body nearly vibrating. With determination, she gripped his waist tighter, whispering, "Not now, sweetheart." But it was too late. His eyes gleamed with certainty, as if he knew something no one else could see. His small mouth opened, ready to release the words forming in his head. And though the courtroom had not yet fallen silent, the air already seemed to thrum with the sense that something unusual was about to happen. The unexpected witness, so small, so innocent, and entirely unsworn, was about to interrupt the solemn machinery of justice with nothing but a child's voice. For now, though, the room hummed with adult concerns. The judge cleared his throat, preparing to deliver a ruling on the objection. A prosecutor glanced briefly at the handler and dog, ready to pivot to his next point. The jurors scribbled quick notes, as though every word mattered. Only the boy seemed to notice the stillness of the German shepherd, the way it lifted its head slightly, ears twitching, eyes alert. His mother rubbed his back, whispering again, "Just a few more minutes." But the boy's mind was already made up. The unexpected witness was no longer content to remain silent. The German shepherd lay at the front of the courtroom like a silent guardian, its broad paws stretched out neatly before it, chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. At first glance, the animal seemed no different from any other police dog, trained and disciplined, accustomed to the restless stillness of human spaces. Yet there was a weight to its presence that did not go unnoticed, even if the adults in the room did their best to treat it as routine. The dog was called Rex, though his name was rarely spoken aloud during court proceedings. To the prosecution, he was not Rex, but K9 Unit 457, a title meant to strip away sentimentality and remind the jury that the animal was part of official procedure. The handler, Officer Matthews, sat beside him with his back straight, uniform neat, eyes always scanning. Matthews' hand rested occasionally on the dog's thick fur, not to comfort, but to reassure, to keep a connection between man and partner, as if the tether itself carried silent communication. To the defense, the dog was more than just evidence. He was a symbol of the entire dispute. The defense attorney argued that Rex's role in the investigation had been flawed, his alert misinterpreted, and the subsequent search unlawful. To them, the shepherd was not a partner in justice, but a wedge in a larger question of constitutional rights. And so, while most of the room regarded the dog as a background fixture, the lawyers saw him as both weapon and liability. But to a child one sitting quietly in the back row, toy car clutched in his hand, the dog was neither evidence nor symbol. To him, Rex was simply a dog, alive and full of secrets, more fascinating than any flag or uniform. Rex's ears twitched as voices rose and fell around him. He was not trained to pay attention to human language in the way jurors did. Words like objection, inadmissible, or sustained meant nothing to him. What he noticed instead were the tones of voices, the rise of tension, the smell of nerves that drifted faintly across the air like invisible clouds. His world was built of scents and sounds layered atop one another. He knew which people in the room carried fear on their skin, which ones carried confidence, and which ones tried to mask unease with the smell of coffee and cologne. Though the adults tried to pretend otherwise, Rex was aware of every shift, the faint creak of a juror's chair, a quick shuffle of papers, the momentary stillness when the judge leaned forward, drawing all eyes to the bench. Rex's gaze swept across the room, always landing back on Matthews, as if checking for silent confirmation. Stay. Wait. Watch. The handler's discipline matched the dog's. Matthews was a veteran officer, mid-40s, with graying temples that spoke of years in service. He had handled Rex since the dog was a pup, training him through endless drills, late-night searches, and high-stress encounters. To him, Rex was more than a partner. He was a measure of certainty in a career where so much else was unpredictable. In private, Matthews thought of the shepherd as family, though in court he wore the stoic mask required of officers. The jurors, however, could not help sneaking glances at the animal. Some were dog lovers, drawn instinctively to the shepherd's steady presence. Others seemed wary, reminded of times they had seen police dogs lunging at suspects on television. The animal stirred something primal in each of them: trust, respect, fear, or even suspicion. The attorneys knew this, which was why Rex's quiet presence mattered so much. He was not simply evidence, he was influence. The defense attorney, a sharp-faced man with restless hands, resented the dog's quiet power. He knew that the jury would see the shepherd and imagine certainty, honesty, even loyalty. Dogs did not lie, after all, or so people believed. It was his job to unravel that perception, to remind the jury that dogs could be mistaken, their handlers biased, their alerts unreliable. Yet as he spoke, his eyes flickered often to the shepherd, as though testing his own ability to resist the animal's pull. The prosecutor, on the other hand, leaned into it. A woman in her 30s, confident and deliberate, she allowed her hand to gesture subtly toward the dog as she questioned witnesses. Her words never lingered on Rex himself, but her presence emphasized him all the same. Here is proof. Here is loyalty. Here is the kind of truth that doesn't falter under cross-examination. The judge, a man seasoned by decades on the bench, pretended not to notice the glances, the unspoken currents. But even he had felt the subtle shift in the room when the dog entered. It wasn't the first time he'd presided over a trial involving a police dog, yet the effect was always the same. There was something about the steady calm of the animal that disrupted human pretenses. People were reminded, against their will, of simplicity of truth sensed rather than debated. And still, through all this adult calculation and strategy, the boy in the back row watched with unfiltered fascination. His little legs swung gently from his mother's lap, his toy car now forgotten in one small fist. The shepherd seemed larger than life to him, as though it radiated secrets no one else could hear. The boy's lips parted slightly, his eyes following every subtle flick of the dog's ears, every shift of its paws. He had no idea what kind of case was unfolding, no knowledge of drugs or laws or civil rights. To him, it was far simpler. There was a dog in the room, and that dog seemed to know. The mother tightened her arms around him, trying to quiet his shifting body. She had seen the way the dog captured his attention, and though she felt a rush of relief that he was distracted from mischief, she also feared the unpredictability of his fascination. Toddlers were known for blurting out truths no one wanted to hear, and though she couldn't imagine what kind of truth her son might find in the dog, She felt the tension rising in his tiny body, as though words were already forming on his lips. At the front, Rex gave a soft, almost inaudible huff of air through his nose. Matthews rested a firm hand on his shoulder, calming him instantly. To most in the courtroom, the sound was nothing a dog breathing, shifting slightly on the hard floor. But to the boy, it was something else entirely. He sat up straighter, toy car sliding to the floor unnoticed. His gaze locked with the shepherd's, and for a moment, it felt as though the two were the only beings truly awake in the room. The courtroom carried on. Voices rose, objections were made, notes scribbled. The steady clicking of the court reporter continued without pause. To the adults, Rex was silent evidence. To the lawyers, he was strategy. To the judge, he was decorum maintained. But to one child, the police dog's presence was not background. It was the center of everything. And soon, that small, uninvited witness would make sure everyone else in the courtroom saw it the same way. The trial moved forward with the steady rhythm of formality, each side locked in a battle of procedure and persuasion. Attorneys volleyed arguments, their voices rising and falling like waves. The jurors sat in their box, pens scratching faintly against notepads. The judge maintained his still posture, his gavel resting like an unspoken threat of authority. To everyone in the room, it was another day in the machinery of justice, serious, ordered, deliberate. But for the small child sitting in the back row on his mother's lap, none of it mattered. The toddler, barely 3 years old, had no understanding of trials or verdicts. He didn't know what it meant to swear an oath, to weigh evidence, or to argue before a jury. His world was built of different measures, bright colors, interesting shapes, familiar voices, and the warmth of his mother's arms. And now, most of all, it was built around the dog sitting calmly at the front of the room. At first, the boy had been restless. His toy car, small, chipped from too much play, had occupied his fingers as the adults droned on about things that made little sense. He rolled it across his mother's lap, pushed it gently against the back of the wooden bench before him, and made soft engine noises under his breath. Each time he grew too loud, his mother gave him a stern look and whispered, "She." He would quiet for a moment, but soon his energy returned. Then he saw the dog. It was as if the rest of the world fell away. His toy car slipped from his grasp, forgotten, clattering softly to the floor. His eyes widened, round with wonder, as they fixed on the shepherd. The boy sat up taller, his small hands pressing against his mother's arm, as though to get a better view. The dog wasn't like the others he had seen in parks or on leashes in his neighborhood. This one looked important, with shiny fur, watchful eyes, and a stillness that seemed powerful. The boy tilted his head, mirroring the shepherd's occasional shift. When the dog's ears flicked at a sound, the boy's did too, though his mother hardly noticed the mimicry. When Rex, as the handler knew him, adjusted his paws, the child leaned forward, studying the movement as though it were a secret signal. His mother whispered again, "Stay still, sweetheart," and smoothed his hair back, her eyes darting anxiously toward the judge. She had dreaded this, her son's fascination, turning into noise that would draw angry stares. She hoped the boy's curiosity would fade, that his short attention span would move him back to his toy car. But toddlers often fixate on the unexpected, and in that moment, nothing in the world mattered more to him than the police dog. The boy's gaze lingered on the animal's eyes. They were deep, steady, unblinking, unlike the people around him, who shifted and whispered. The dog seemed certain. And though the boy could not put words to it, he felt as though the shepherd knew something no one else did. He tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mama," he whispered. She shook her head, quickly placing a finger to her lips. Quiet, but he tugged again, more insistent this time. Mama, doggy. Her heart skipped, and she shook her head harder, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She pressed her palm gently over his small hands, anchoring them in place. Not now, she mouthed. Still, the boy's attention was unwavering. The courtroom air was heavy, filled with legal jargon and adult concerns. The prosecutor's voice droned on, reading from transcripts. The defense attorney objected, his words sharp, echoing against the high ceilings. Somewhere, a cough broke the silence, followed by the shuffle of a juror's chair. Yet through all this, the child heard only the faint breaths of the dog. He saw the way its chest rose and fell, the way its eyes flickered toward its handler. And back again. The boy felt, in that inexplicable way children sometimes do, that the dog was not just sitting there. It was waiting, watching, knowing. The little one leaned forward again, his finger twitching toward the animal. He wanted to point, to tell everyone what he saw, but his mother's firm grip held him still. She pressed her cheek against his. Hair murmuring, almost done, just a little longer. But time meant little to a child. Minutes stretched endlessly, and his fascination grew heavier, demanding release. His lips moved silently at first, forming words he dared not say aloud. Doggy knows. He whispered it so faintly that even his mother didn't catch it. The words tumbled in his mind like a chant, insistent and certain. Across the room, the shepherd shifted again, and the boy's breath caught. His eyes widened, and he slapped his small palm softly against his mother's arm in excitement. She grabbed his wrist, alarmed, whispering fiercely, "Stop it, or we'll have to leave." But leaving was impossible in his mind. He couldn't look away now. He couldn't abandon the secret he was sure the dog carried. The adults could argue all they wanted, but he knew, deep in the pure and untangled logic of childhood, that the dog had the answer. He wriggled again, his mother holding tighter. She could feel the tension in him, the way his little body vibrated with determination. He was gathering courage, like a spring winding tighter and tighter. And still, the courtroom pressed on, oblivious. The lawyers bickered, the judge listened, the jurors scribbled. Only the child noticed the shepherd's eyes flick back toward the crowd, meeting his own for a brief, electrifying moment. The boy's heart thumped, certain the dog had really seen him. That was when he decided he would speak. His mother saw it in his posture, the sudden shift, the way his small shoulders squared with determination. She hissed a final warning in his ear. Don't. Please, not now. But toddlers do not bargain. Once their truth takes root, it blossoms without restraint. The boy pressed his lips together and parted them again, testing the sound quietly. He raised his finger, small and insistent, pointing toward the shepherd. His voice caught in his throat at first, uncertain. But the certainty in his eyes grew brighter with every breath. The moment was seconds away. And though no one in the courtroom realized it yet, the carefully constructed order of the trial, its rules, its arguments, its solemnity, was about to be interrupted by the one person who had no role in the proceedings. The child's attention, innocent and unrelenting, was about to command the room in a way no lawyer, no judge, no officer could. The courtroom thrummed with the kind of rhythm that comes when adults think they are fully in control. Lawyers clashed in precise tones, each word measured, each phrase sharpened like a blade. The jury scribbled in their notepads, brows furrowed, pretending to sift logic from rhetoric. The judge presided from his high bench, dignified and still, a silent conductor orchestrating the slow march of justice. To everyone there, the scene unfolded as expected, tense, serious, but contained. But in the back row, a child shifted on his mother's lap, and in that tiny shift, the balance of the room tilted toward the unexpected. His toy car was gone, abandoned on the floor. His mother's whispers and gentle restraints had failed to hold him still. His small hand, round and dimpled, began to rise, trembling with a kind of determination far too large for his age. His gaze, unbreakable, remained locked on the German shepherd at the front of the room. The dog, Rex, seemed to notice. His ears pricked slightly, head tilting just enough to suggest awareness. To most, it was nothing, just a trained animal reacting to sound or motion. But to the boy, it was confirmation. The dog knew. He leaned forward, lips parting, his finger pointing with all the certainty his 3-year-old mind could muster. Doggy knows. The words weren't loud in the way adults think of loudness. They weren't shouted with force or anger. But they were sharp, piercing through the hum of the courtroom like a bell struck in still air. His high-pitched voice carried clear, unshaken, refusing to be lost in the shuffle of adult concerns. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The prosecutor froze mid-question, her mouth still open, as though the words she had been about to speak were trapped in her throat. The defense attorney stopped his scribbling, his pen hovering above his pad, eyes darting toward the back. A juror's chair creaked as its occupant shifted, startled. Even the judge blinked once, slowly, leaning back slightly, as though to make sense of what he had just heard. Doggy knows. The boy repeated it, this time louder, with a clarity that left no doubt in anyone's mind. His finger stretched straight and certain, accusing yet innocent, aimed at the shepherd, who now sat upright, ears forward, tail stiff against the floor. His mother's heart plummeted. She grabbed his hand, trying to pull it down, whispering frantically, "No, no, not here, sweetheart, please." Her cheeks burned hot with embarrassment. She glanced desperately toward the judge, silently begging for mercy, for the moment to pass without consequence. But silence had already claimed the courtroom. It wasn't the awkward silence of a pause in testimony, nor the formal silence demanded by order. It was deeper, heavier, a silence of stunned disbelief. Every adult present, no matter how hardened by law or routine, felt the weight of innocence cracking through their careful composure. The bailiff, standing near the wall, straightened. Instinctively, his hand twitching toward the child, as though unsure whether to intervene. The handler, Officer Matthews, stiffened in his seat, his grip tightening on Rex's lead. The shepherd remained still but alert, eyes fixed now on the boy, as though some unspoken communication had sparked between them. "Doggy knows," the boy said again, softer now, almost like a secret he was sharing with the room. His voice, stripped of hesitation, carried with it a peculiar conviction. The words hung in the air, defying explanation. Some jurors smiled faintly, unable to hide a curve of amusement on their lips. Others frowned, brows knitted, their thoughts not on humor, but on the strange truth of it. Why did those words feel heavier than they should? A child had spoken nonsense, yes, but the echo of it lingered. The defense attorney broke first, clearing his throat and adjusting his tie, his voice rising with irritation. "Your Honor, may we?" The judge raised a hand. Not yet. He studied the child, then the mother, and finally the dog. His judicial mask remained, but something in his eyes betrayed curiosity. It wasn't protocol to indulge such an interruption, yet he knew instinctively that this was no ordinary disruption. A courtroom thrives on control, but every now and then something raw and unfiltered pierced through the practiced rituals. And when it did, people remembered. The mother whispered fiercely, "Stop it, please, not another word." She pulled her son close, her arm wrapping tight around him, rocking him slightly as though to soothe away his boldness. Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes, not of sadness, but of panic, the kind only a parent knows when the world is watching their child in judgment. But the boy wasn't ashamed. His little chest puffed with pride. He believed wholeheartedly that he had just said something important. He looked around the room with bright eyes, expecting nods of agreement, expecting the adults to finally understand what he saw so clearly. "Doggy knows," he whispered again, almost to himself this time, as though it were undeniable. The shepherd's handler shifted uneasily. Matthews cleared his throat, adjusting his grip on the lead, as if to remind the court that Rex was still just a working animal, not a prophet. Yet even he couldn't dismiss the peculiar way the dog sat now straight-backed, alert, gaze unblinking on the boy in the back row. The silence stretched, heavy and awkward. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice slow, careful, but tinged with something that almost sounded like wonder. "Order," he said softly. Not the sharp crack of authority, but a reminder, an anchor pulling the room back from whatever strange spell had taken hold. He tapped his gavel once, the sound sharp against wood. Yet even with order restored, the mood had shifted. The trial would continue, yes. The attorneys would resume their arguments, the evidence would be examined, the procedures would be followed. But no one could erase what had just happened. The boy's words had pierced through the layers of seriousness, planting themselves in the minds of everyone present. "Doggy knows." Simple, childlike, but uncheckable. The mother sank into her seat, face buried briefly in her son's hair, whispering apologies to anyone within earshot. She wished desperately for invisibility, for the ground to swallow her whole. But her son, unaffected, wriggled happily, his mission complete. He had seen something others ignored, and he had named it aloud. Across the room, the jurors exchanged glances, some rolling their eyes, others still smiling faintly. But a few looked thoughtful, pen tips hovering just above their notepads, as if considering whether to write it down. The attorneys returned to their postures, though both prosecution and defense carried tension in their eyes now. The prosecutor allowed herself the smallest flicker of a smile, knowing the moment had played into her hands. The defense attorney clenched his jaw, silently, cursing the unpredictable weight of innocence. And Rex, the dog at the center of it all, gave a low exhale, his chest rising with the effort. His gaze remained steady, unbroken, fixed on the boy who had dared to speak. The trial had not changed in substance. No evidence had shifted, no ruling had been overturned, but the narrative had changed. The atmosphere had changed, and deep in the minds of those who would decide the verdict, a child's words echoed louder than the longest arguments. "Doggy knows." The sudden gesture, the raised finger, the piercing declaration, it would not be forgotten. The words had already been spoken, clear and ringing through the room. "Doggy knows," and then came silence. Not the orderly silence the judge demanded at the beginning of proceedings. Not the polite hush of people waiting their turn to speak. This was a heavier kind of silence, the kind that falls after something has happened that no one was prepared for, the kind that demands recognition whether or not anyone is willing to give it. Every person in that courtroom seemed suspended, as if the air itself had thickened. The scratch of pens stopped. The creak of wooden benches halted mid-motion. Even the steady clicking of the court reporter's machine faltered, the typist's fingers pausing above the keys, as though she, too, needed to take in what had just been said. The child sat proudly on his mother's lap, his small fingers still outstretched toward the German shepherd. His words lingered in the air, like an echo that refused to fade. His mother's arms tightened around him, as if by sheer force she could pull him back into silence, erase the sound of his little voice. Her face burned with embarrassment, her lips pressed into hurried apologies, whispered to no one in particular. Yet she knew her words meant nothing now. The boy's voice had carried farther than hers ever could. Up front, Officer Matthews sat rigid, his hand locked around Rex's lead. The shepherd hadn't moved much, though his posture was different. Now, head lifted, ears pricked, gaze alert and direct. Matthews hated that people might read meaning into that change. Hated that the boy's innocent declaration seemed almost validated by the dog's sudden attentiveness. He told himself it was coincidence, simple animal reaction. But deep down, he couldn't shake the uneasy thought. What if the dog did know something no one else could? The prosecutor's lips pressed together, hiding a smile. She knew she wasn't. Supposed to indulge in theatrics, the trials were not meant to be swayed by spectacle or sentiment. But she also knew jurors were human, and humans carried stories in their bones. A child's words carried weight in ways that adult testimony never could. Doggy knows. It was almost too perfect, the kind of phrase that could nestle in the usu. Juries' minds, resurfacing when they deliberated. She kept her face composed, but her mind raced. How could she harness this without appearing manipulative? The defense attorney, meanwhile, nearly boiled with frustration. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie, his pen stabbing against the notepad as if to reclaim control. He hated how the silence favored the boy's words, how the stillness made them grow louder in memory rather than fade. Nonsense, he thought bitterly. A toddler's outburst, nothing more. But even as he dismissed it, he saw the jurors' faces, the way some leaned back as if considering it, the way others smiled faintly as though charmed. He cursed under his breath. Innocence was a dangerous opponent because it could not be cross-examined. The judge remained still for longer than anyone expected. His gavel sat idle on the bench, his hand resting near it, but not moving. He had seen hundreds of cases, presided over thousands of testimonies, but he could not recall a moment like this. A child's voice had silenced the machinery of law. He reminded himself sternly that it was irrelevant, an interruption to be brushed aside. And yet, he could not help but acknowledge the odd gravity of it. He saw the way jurors reacted, the way attorneys stiffened. He heard the boy's words replaying in his mind, stubbornly refusing to dissolve. The jurors themselves were perhaps the most conflicted. 12 people, ordinary citizens, suddenly bound by law to weigh evidence and truth. Some smiled at the innocence of the boy's declaration, charmed by the honesty of it. Others frowned, disapproving of the disruption, reminding themselves to focus on facts. But just a few, couldn't help but feel the sting of recognition. Didn't they themselves wonder whether the dog's presence carried truth? Didn't the shepherd's calm vigilance whisper something that words could not? The child had said aloud what some of them had quietly thought, but never dared to speak. The dog knows. The bailiff shifted his stance uneasily. He had seen outbursts. Before, angry defendants, sobbing witnesses, impatient families, but never this. What was he supposed to do? Remove a 3-year-old? The thought seemed absurd, almost cruel. He stayed still, waiting for the judge's cue, silently grateful that the gavel hadn't struck yet. The silence stretched on, filling every corner of the chamber. Even the air felt different, charged with something fragile and electric. Time itself seemed to slow, as though the moment demanded to be absorbed fully before the trial could continue. The boy, oblivious to the weight of it all, wiggled happily in his mother's lap. To him, the room's frozen stillness was proof that people had listened. He had spoken, and the world had heard. His mother bent low, whispering harshly into his ear, "Enough! No more talking." But he only smiled, resting his small head against her chest, his mission complete. And still the silence clung. Finally, the judge moved. His hand lifted the gavel, the motion deliberate, slow, as if he himself were reluctant to shatter the quiet. He tapped it once, not hard, but firm enough to break the trance. The sound cracked against the wooden desk, reverberating through the chamber. "Order," he said, his voice carrying steadiness. Yet beneath the authority lay something else, a subtle recognition that order had already been broken in. Way no gavel could fix. The attorneys shifted back into motion, the machinery of trial creaking to life again. The prosecutor gathered her notes. The defense attorney straightened his shoulders. The jurors picked up their pens. Words resumed. The silence lifted. But the spell was not gone. The boy's words remained, lodged in memory. Even as new testimony unfolded, as evidence was discussed, as procedure pressed forward, every person in that room carried the echo of that small, piercing voice. Doggy knows. It was nonsense. It was nothing. It was irrelevant to the case. And yet, it was everything. Because in that silence, that heavy, breathtaking silence, everyone in the courtroom had felt something they couldn't easily explain. They had felt truth stripped of complexity, truth delivered with the simplicity only a child could provide. The silence had not been empty at all. It had been full. The silence had lingered for far too long. For one impossible stretch of time, the courtroom had been bound together by the echo of a toddler's voice, suspended in the fragile stillness that followed. And then, as though the air itself demanded, release, the reactions began. A chuckle escaped first, sharp and nervous, from one of the jurors on the far right. It wasn't cruel nor mocking, but it rippled through the stillness like a pebble tossed into water. Another juror smiled faintly, their lips twitching against their will. A third covered their mouth, not to stifle laughter, but to hide their expression, as though revealing amusement might somehow break the solemnity of their duty. But not all smiles were born of warmth. Some faces twisted in disapproval. An older juror in the front row adjusted her glasses sharply, her mouth pressed thin, eyes stern. To her, this was a disruption, an embarrassment, a reminder that justice was not supposed to be interrupted by childish innocence. She scribbled something on her notepad, no one knew what, but the motion itself was crisp, almost punitive. The attorneys responded in predictable but telling ways. The prosecutor kept her expression carefully composed, but inside, her mind spun with opportunity. She could never reference the boy's words directly, not without being reprimanded by the judge, but she didn't need to. Jurors had heard. Jurors had felt. All she had to do now was lean into that emotional weight subtly, allowing the child's words to bloom naturally in their thoughts when deliberation time came. She glanced briefly at the jury, noting which faces looked charmed, which thoughtful. Seeds had been planted. The defense attorney, on the other hand, struggled. Visibly, his jaw tightened, his pen tapping furiously against his legal pad, each strike a physical outlet for his irritation. He hated this. He hated how the room had bent, however briefly, to the whim of a toddler's imagination. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't admissible. It wasn't fair. And yet, he saw the jurors' faces too. He saw the softening of expressions, the way some seemed enchanted by the interruption. He muttered to himself, low and sharp, "We'll have to undo this. We'll have to crush it." At the front of the room, Officer Matthews shifted uncomfortably. His hand remained firm on Rex's lead, but even he felt the weight of the boy's words. He tried to remind himself. Rex was a dog, a tool, a trained animal, nothing more. But the shepherd's posture unsettled him. The dog sat upright, eyes bright, gaze fixed on the boy with an intensity that seemed unusual, even for Rex. Matthews glanced down at his partner, whispering under his breath, so softly no one else could. "Here, stay steady, boy." But the unease in his chest would not settle. The judge finally broke the tension with another firm rap of the gavel. "That will be enough," he said, voice stern but tinged with weariness. His gaze swept the room, demanding a return to order. And yet, he could not bring himself to scold the child or the mother. Instead, His eyes lingered on them for a moment, not unkindly, as though acknowledging that some interruptions carried weight, even when they did not belong. The bailiff let out a slow breath, shoulders dropping. He had been braced for action, waiting for the judge's order to remove the mother and child. But that command hadn't come. Instead, the boy remained, still sitting small and wide-eyed in his mother's lap, his finger finally lowered, but his pride undimmed. The bailiff shifted his stance, uncertain whether to keep watching the child more closely or return his attention to the standard proceedings. The mother, however, could not relax. Her heart raced in her chest, her palms slick with sweat as she held her son tighter, whispering fiercely in his ear, "You cannot do that again. Do you understand? Not another word. Please, sweetheart. You have to be quiet." Her voice cracked, heavy with the fear of judgment, of being thrown out, of being remembered not for her case or her connection to the trial, but for the outburst of her toddler. She stroked his hair rapidly, as though smoothing him into silence. But the boy was not embarrassed. He did not share his mother's panic. Instead, he wore a small smile, the kind of smile children carry when they know they have said something important, something that mattered. He leaned his head against her chest, eyes still drifting toward the shepherd, as though proud of his truth. He whispered softly, too quiet for anyone but his mother to hear, "He knows, Mama. Doggy knows." Her stomach twisted at the words. She pressed her lips against his hair, shushing him, rocking gently as though to lull him into quiet. But his certainty lingered. Meanwhile, the jurors had begun exchanging glances. The chuckles had died down, but a strange energy still rippled among them. Some seemed almost wistful, as though reminded of children in their own families. Others wore guarded expressions, clearly working to push aside the interruption, to focus on the seriousness of their role. Yet the words lingered in their minds, whether they wanted them to or not. Doggy knows. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't admissible. But it carried the purity of something undeniable, the kind of statement that sticks in the marrow rather than the mind. The courtroom settled again into motion. The attorneys resumed their arguments, their voices rising and falling in practiced cadence. The court reporter's keys clattered once more, filling the air with the rhythm of record. Chairs creaked, pens scratched. On the surface, order had been restored. But beneath that surface, the ripple of human reactions carried on. The prosecutor's confidence sharpened. The defense attorney's irritation deepened. The jurors' faces remained softer than before, touched by something they could not quite name. The judge, though outwardly stern, carried a flicker of thought he could not entirely dismiss. And Matthews, hand resting on Rex's fur, could not shake the unease. That perhaps, in some strange way, the child had spoken a truth no one else dared. And then there was the dog. Rex remained steady, unmoving, but his gaze lingered where no one else's did, on the boy. His ears remained pricked, his body tense but not restless, his eyes alive with something that, to the child at least, looked like understanding. The human reactions were many: laughter, frowns, unease, strategy, fear, pride. But one reaction stood apart from all the rest: the unwavering, unreadable stillness of the shepherd, watching silently as though he alone knew what none of them did. The courtroom had returned to order, at least on the surface. Voices filled the air again, the rhythm of testimony and objection continuing as though nothing unusual had happened. The prosecutor questioned, the defense countered, the judge ruled, the jurors scribbled. To the casual observer, the interruption by a child was already fading, another footnote in the life of a busy courthouse. But beneath the polished surface, something had shifted. The boy's words echoed in minds, whether invited or not. Doggy knows. 3 simple syllables, uttered without calculation, without agenda. Words that belonged to no argument, no evidence, no legal framework. And yet they clung to the memory of every adult who had heard them. The jurors, 12 strangers. Bound into temporary unity, each wrestled with the meaning privately. One of them, a young man with sharp features and restless energy, found himself distracted, his pen tapping against the margin of his notepad. He kept replaying the boy's voice in his head. Why did it sound so certain? He had no patience. For sentiment, prided himself on being rational, but there was something in the child's conviction that unsettled him. He scribbled the words in the corner of his notes, almost without realizing it. Later, when he looked down, the phrase would be there like a seed taking root. Another juror, an older woman with soft eyes, leaned into the sentiment rather than away from it. She had grandchildren at home, and she knew the strange clarity children often carried. They said things adults were too afraid or too jaded to voice. Out of the mouths of babes, she thought, the old phrase whispering through her mind. She caught herself staring at the shepherd, wondering if maybe, just maybe, the child was right. Others resisted. A stern man in a blue tie scowled at the memory, reminding himself firmly that their role was to weigh facts, not fairy tales. A toddler's proclamation had no place in deliberation. He underlined his notes twice, as though doubling down on reason could scrub away the child's echo. But even as he wrote, he felt irritation prick at him. Why couldn't he stop hearing it? The attorneys, too, felt the ripple in their own ways. The prosecutor leaned into subtlety. She never referenced the words directly, but her tone softened when she spoke of the shepherd. She lingered on the dog's reliability, its training, its ability to detect truth where humans might miss it. She let the jurors make the connection themselves, planting seeds without ever being seen to water them. Every so often, her eyes flicked toward the jury box, searching for signs. She saw the faint smiles, the thoughtful frowns, the guarded pens. The boy's words had become hers without her needing to claim them. The defense attorney, meanwhile, fought against shadows. He felt as though he were battling not just the prosecutor's arguments, but the ghost of a child's voice. He found himself raising his voice more than usual, sharpening his tone, cutting harder into testimony. He hoped force would break the spell. But force could not erase what innocence had already planted. The more aggressive he became, the more. He risked making the jurors resent him, the very opposite of what he needed. And deep down, though he would never admit it, a part of him understood the danger. Jurors wanted stories. And the boy had given them one, raw and unforgettable. The judge was perhaps the most conflicted of all. He was trained to keep his mind clear, to dismiss irrelevancies, to preserve the integrity of the law. And yet, when the courtroom quieted again, when attorneys returned to their dance of questions and objections, he found himself staring at the shepherd. The boy's voice returned to him like an echo. Doggy knows. The judge knew it was nothing, a child's imagination. But imagination had power. He had seen jurors swayed by less. He sighed quietly, adjusting the papers before him, reminding himself of his oath. And still, the thought lingered. The mother, still trembling from embarrassment, tried to soothe her son into silence. She rocked him gently, whispered promises of treats if he stayed quiet, ran her hand over his hair in nervous strokes. But she could not undo what had been done. Her child's words had escaped into the air, and now they belonged to the world, beyond her control. She feared people would remember her as the woman with the disruptive toddler. But part of her, the smallest, quietest part, wondered why her son had sounded so sure, why he had locked eyes with the shepherd and spoken as though he saw something no one else did. And then there was the boy himself. He no longer felt the need to speak. To him, the job was done. He had named the truth aloud, and the silence that had followed was proof enough that people had heard. He curled against his mother's chest, but his eyes stayed fixed on the shepherd. He smiled softly, secure in his certainty. The adults might pretend to ignore him, but he knew the dog knew. That was enough. The shepherd, steady and unmoving, remained the only one not bound by human confusion. His body was tense, but calm, his gaze sharp. He did not understand the child's words in the human sense, but his instincts were alive, tuned to subtleties the people around him ignored. And in that shared gaze between child and animal, something unspoken seemed to pass, not knowledge, perhaps, but recognition. Deeper meaning. It was not in the words themselves, but in the way they unsettled the adults. They reminded them that truth is not always found in polished arguments, in evidence laid neatly before them. Sometimes it breaks through from unexpected places, a child's voice, a dog's silent watch, a moment no one had planned. The deeper meaning was not legal. It was human. And so, while the trial pressed on, while words filled the air again, every person carried a private struggle. Some fought to dismiss it. Some clung to it quietly. Some feared it would grow larger than it deserved. But none could fully escape it. The boy had spoken, and the echo remained. Doggy knows. And though the verdict would one day be rendered by human hands, those words had already shaped the story of the trial, the story people would remember long after the gavel fell. Arguments resumed, witnesses were called, and exhibits were entered into evidence. The hum of procedure filled the room once more, steady and relentless, the way the justice system always did. To an outsider walking in, it might have seemed as though nothing unusual had ever occurred. The courtroom looked the same, the judge presiding with measured authority, the attorneys weaving their cases, the jury scribbling dutiful notes, the bailiff standing guard, the shepherd resting calmly by Officer Matthews' side. But those who had been there knew the truth. The room was not the same. Something had shifted the moment a child pointed and spoke. The trial stretched on for days. Testimonies grew lengthy. Evidence was debated, dissected, challenged. Objections rose and fell like waves against a shoreline. The jurors did their best to remain focused, to weigh each fact carefully. But still, unbidden, the boy's words returned to them in quiet moments. Doggy knows. A voice that had not been sworn in, a statement that had no place in evidence, and yet it lingered all the same. When the time for deliberation came, the jurors filed into the private chamber, their faces solemn with responsibility. They carried binders of notes, memories of testimony, instructions from the judge. They knew their duty, and they took it seriously. But even there, behind closed doors, the memory of the interruption hovered. Some laughed softly, recalling the moment as comic relief in an otherwise heavy trial. Others scowled, insisting it was irrelevant. And yet, more than one admitted privately that they couldn't quite shake the conviction in the boy's small voice, the strange feeling that innocence had pierced through where argument had failed. Eventually, they returned with their verdict. The decision, rendered in the measured, official tones of law, would shape the outcome of the case, closed the chapter on the trial. The judge thanked them. The attorneys nodded. The gavel fell. On paper, the story was complete. But in memory, the story had only begun. Because the case itself, its arguments, its evidence, its verdict would fade. Most people, even those in the courtroom, would struggle to recall the finer details. Years later, they would forget the names of witnesses, the exact points argued, the language of legal instruction. The verdict might live in records, but not in hearts. What they would remember, however, was the silence. The silence after a toddler's voice broke through the machinery of law. The silence in which everyone, jurors, judge, attorneys, officers, had been stripped of their roles and left only as human beings hearing the certainty of a child. That was the story people carried away, The prosecutor, years later, would recall it not in terms of strategy, but as a moment when truth and innocence collided. She would tell colleagues, "There was this case once, and in the middle of it, a 3-year-old pointed at the K9 and said, 'Doggy knows.' The whole room froze. I swear, it changed the mood of the trial. The defense attorney, despite his irritation, would remember it too. In private moments, he admitted to himself that the interruption had haunted him more than any cross-examination. He told the story as a cautionary tale, warning younger lawyers that the courtroom was never entirely within their control. "You can plan everything," he would say, "but you can't plan for the truth children see." The jurors, each returning to their ordinary lives, would carry it into conversations with family. Some told it at dinner tables, laughing at the absurdity of a toddler disrupting a trial. Others recounted it more solemnly, reflecting on how a child's innocent certainty had felt heavier than 100 pages of testimony. The words slipped into family lore, passed on like folklore. Once, in court, a little boy pointed at a dog and said it knew the truth. The judge, though he would never admit it publicly, remembered too. In his long career, he had presided over countless trials, most blurred together into a fog of motions and verdicts. But this one stayed sharp. He thought of it sometimes when his robe hung heavy on his shoulders, when the burden of law felt particularly weighty. He would recall the moment when the gavel had not been enough, when silence ruled stronger than authority. And he would remember that the law was a system of people, not perfection, and that sometimes clarity came from the most unlikely sources. Officer Matthews, long after Rex had retired from service, told the story often. He spoke of the shepherd's steadiness, his loyalty, his uncanny instinct. And always, he returned to that day. "The kid said doggy knows," Matthews would say, shaking his head with a half-smile. And the crazy thing? Rex sat up straighter, looked right at him, like they were in on the same secret. "I don't care what anyone says. Sometimes I think that boy was right." And then there was the mother. For her, the memory carried both shame and pride. In the moment, she had wanted nothing more than to disappear, to silence her son, to undo his interruption. But with time, the sting of embarrassment faded, and what remained was something different. She remembered his certainty, his innocence, the way he had spoken truth without fear. And she realized, perhaps more than anyone, that her child had given voice to something no one else dared. The boy himself, of course, grew older. He would not always remember the day in sharp detail. Memories from such a young age blurred into fragments. But he carried something of it, a story retold to him enough times to live in his bones. When you were 3, people said, you pointed at a police dog in court and said, "Doggy knows." He laughed at first, embarrassed by the tale. But as he grew, he recognized the odd kind of power it carried, the reminder that sometimes truth is simple, even when the world insists on making it complicated. And so the trial became more than a case. It became a story. Not a story about guilt or innocence, not a story about verdicts or evidence, but a story about humanity breaking through the machinery of law, about innocence piercing solemnity, about how a single child's voice could silence a room full of adults and leave an imprint stronger than any legal argument. A story remembered, one that spread through hallways and offices, whispered among courthouse staff, retold at dinner tables, recalled years later by lawyers and jurors alike. A story that became legend in its own small way. Because long after the verdict was forgotten, people still remembered the silence. They remembered the finger pointing, the voice small but certain, the shepherd's steady gaze. They remembered the way the courtroom froze, bound together not by law but by humanity. And they remembered the words, "Doggy knows."